everyone. Welcome to this month's cyber threat briefing again from ShowCloud. Obviously delighted to have you all with us again. We've got a few different topics today to talk about, and we're going to finish on an opinion piece, let's say. So I don't think we were quite agreed on everything in this one, so this might be an interesting episode. As always, we are joined by Hugh Rayner.
Hello.
And we're also joined by Arron as well.
Hi, everyone.
Excellent. So, welcome, guys, as always. Just to note, this will be the last episode that we do before we finish. But we're going to have a little break over summer. We're back in September with the briefing, as you were. Right, so guys, we've got a couple of topics of discussion today. So, we're going to talk about WordPress security. And I guess the major question is it still a problem in 2023? And the reason we're going to cover this is because we haven't covered it yet. And it's quite a big part of, I guess, the internet. So the few bits that caught my eye this week as we were looking through topics to cover. And so we'll cover WordPress, but quite in a general sense, and what organizations can do now to kind of secure their WordPress instances, for example. We're also going to talk about the US cyber trust mark. That's something that was announced by the administration in the US over the past few days. But we've got an underlying question there, which is can mandatory standards really drive security improvement? So we're going to explore a little bit around standards and the role they play in the cybersecurity market as well. So we'll have a quick jump into the WordPress security piece. So what is WordPress? Well, a quick recap on it. And there's a couple of stats here that were a bit eye-opening to me when I first read them. So WordPress is essentially a website that's got a CMS built into it, so it allows people to spin up a website pretty quickly and manage it. There are actually, according to an article, some research that's been done, there's 835 million sites on the internet that use WordPress, and there's over 2 million downloads of WordPress every single year. So it's quite a big deal. I think it makes up 40-something% of the overall internet estate is WordPress or WordPress of some description. Selling points are it's quite easy to use and quite easy to spin up. And what that does is it kind of lowers the bar of entry to get someone getting a website on the internet. They may not have the full kind of understanding or appreciation of all the things that they need to do to secure that WordPress instance. The reason we're going to talk about it today in this episode, is two things that came to light as we were looking for kind of the news over the past few weeks. And there were two essentially fairly critical vulnerabilities in WordPress plugins. So the first one is the WooCommerce plugin, and the second one is the all-in-one security, and that's actually a security plugin, which is vulnerable and impacts on the overall security of the WordPress instance. So the first one, the WooCommerce plugin, so essentially that's a fairly critical vulnerability that basically exploits containing a specific header cause vulnerable sites to treat additional payloads as if they were coming from an administrative user. So what they're trying to do is basically fake the fact that an administrative user is sending a request, and what they're then doing is basically installing plugins in the back end through this mechanism. What that allows you to do is then execute malicious code. So there's a fairly critical vulnerability around in the WooCommerce plugin that allows users, essentially low-level privileged users, to essentially execute malicious code and put a file uploader or whatever it is that they want to do with their newfound access and to get some persistence and get some access to the WordPress instance. It's a fairly big piece. We're not going to cover that in depth beyond that kind of summary. Just bear in mind that there are things like that out in the wild, and quite a lot of them. The other vulnerability that caught my eye was the all-in-one security, so AIOS, and that's a WordPress security plugin. So this is something that you can basically install in your instance of WordPress. It's got a web app firewall, content protection, login security tools, and it's sold as something that stops bots and prevents brute force attacks. What it was actually doing was logging plain text passwords off of login attempts. So someone come along to the site, attempts to log in, puts their password in. It was actually then storing that password in plain text in a text file outside of the database. So the impact of that is an administrator or someone who has got file access to the underlying system can therefore just read the valid plain text credentials what it means is they don't, if you've got a privileged access onto the box already, yes, you can pull the passwords, but they'll be hashed. Well, yeah, they'll be hashed, and therefore we'll need cracking offline. Whereas these ones were just the straight up password in a text file, so obviously immediately reusable as well elsewhere. So they were the two things that caught our eye, and what we want to do now is talk about WordPress generally and give you a flavour of what it is and kind of what the attack surface looks like and how the types of vulnerabilities that are commonly identified and crucially the things that you should do as an organisation now to protect your WordPress instances. So Arron, excuse my long rambling start to the podcast, but could you talk us through what the attack surface of WordPress and also actually similar CMS applications, so WordPress isn't alone in what it does and what it offers, could you just talk us through the attack surface of it and what it essentially is under the hood?
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, WordPress is just a CMS. There are others on the market. So actually, the attack surface of WordPress is pretty similar to those other CMSs. But when we break it down, what do we have on a CMS like WordPress? Well, you've got the website element, that front-facing user element. So users may be able to, if it's a static website, probably not do a lot other than browse the front end that's presented to them. But if you've got an interactive website, maybe there are forms and submissions. So that is the first instance, that user input, making sure that's protected. But WordPress is much larger than that. Because it's a CMS, you've got the admin panel side to it. And this is the really interesting bit, I think, that you've got privileged users that will log in to manage your WordPress site, either directly through the site itself, WP-admin, that URL that everyone knows to log into the WordPress admin instances. That's the default URL for the admin login page. Once you're logged in as an administrator or even as a low privileged administrative user, you've got the ability to start making changes to the site. And WordPress in particular has this really large ecosystem of plugins, which you've touched on already, Nick, that allow you to enhance the features of your website. It's the main selling point of WordPress, really. It's that adaptability of it, the fact that you can just grab a plugin, it changes the way your site works, it gives you new metrics, it does extra performance monitoring or statistics, loads of ways to make your site useful and tailorable to yourself. But that, along with being WordPress's biggest strength, is actually its biggest weakness. It's a semi-unregulated market for plugins, in the sense that that there is some level of checks that WordPress themselves do, but for the most part, if you publish something and people start giving it a good rating, it's going to sit there on WordPress and end up being used. On top of that, you don't even have to use the official plugin store. You could just download a plugin off the internet and use it on your website without going through the official routes. So there's this inherent risk associated with all of this third-party created plugin content being used on your WordPress site, and that's typically where we end up seeing vulnerabilities in WordPress. The other thing, of course, that's worth noting here is WordPress itself, as you mentioned, it has a huge market share, and that makes it a target for attackers. That means that attackers are looking for vulnerabilities in plugins that exist. They're looking at developing their own plugins and trying to get people to install them or find ways to bypass security mechanisms that exist within WordPress. So just because of its market ubiquity, it's got a lot of eyes on it from malicious actors, because they know if they can compromise a well-used WordPress instance or find a 0 day, shall we say, in WordPress, then they know they're going to be able to compromise millions, hundreds of millions of websites.
Brilliant, thanks, Arron. Hugh, I'm going to bring you in here. So from a pen testing perspective, what types of vulnerabilities do we commonly identify within WordPress sites? We test them quite often. They'll come up fairly regularly on things that clients want us to look at. So what are the kind of key vulnerabilities that we do find?
Yeah, so I guess before we can dive into that, worth a bit of clarification on this. When we talk about WordPress, there's really sort of two WordPresses that we can be talking about. There's WordPress.org, which is a self-hosted instance where you install the CMS on your own server, you set up the backend database and things like that. And there's WordPress.com, which is like a SaaS solution where you're running your WordPress site on WordPress, the commercial arm of WordPress's infrastructure. So the vulnerabilities that affect those are slightly different in terms of the way they work as well. So obviously with a self-hosted instance, the potential consequence of exploitation of a vulnerability is a lot more significant, because you're potentially allowing that attacker into your organization's infrastructure rather than a sort of isolated area that you're exclusively using to host a website. But really, given the number of plugins and the way that they work, we are seeing the hundreds of different types of vulnerability, really, and really impactful ones as well. WordPress runs and uses SQL, so commonly we'll see SQL injection attacks, and really, I guess, like Arron mentioned earlier, we've got the WordPress core and the WordPress plugins. Anyone can produce these plugins. You don't need to be a skilled developer. You don't need to know anything about secure development practices or anything like that. You're able to develop this plugin, connect it into the WordPress instance, and leave it running there forever, which obviously presents quite a significant risk. So we do see issues with the WordPress core itself that is developed and maintained by the WordPress organization. They update that normally about once a quarter normally. That will fix really significant bug fixes, vulnerabilities, and things like that, but actually only makes up about 4 or 5% of the total number of vulnerabilities and things that are being exploited. So that leaves 95% living in outdated plugins and themes and things like that, which, as we said, they could be entirely abandoned projects that aren't going to get updated. So yes, so that these plugins are really highly used and less supported. And I guess another issue that we see there is issues with dependencies as well. So an organization might have they might have had a custom theme developed, as is common with larger organizations, and that theme will then have dependencies on the WordPress core version. If core updates, there is then that sort of inherent latency between when the core gets updated and when that organization's theme can get updated. So that we often see a lag between a critical vulnerability being announced and patched, and then an organization being able to adopt that, because they're not going to want to necessarily completely change the theme of their website to get that updated on day one. They might wait a week for that to happen. So yeah, a large sort of, I guess, expanding on Arron's earlier point about the attack surface, that is a significant issue for them as well. We often also see additional vulnerabilities in the way that WordPress plugins operate. So if we go back to sort of imagining it like a mobile phone, right, where you've got the App Store, all of those, all of the applications that you're downloading from the official App Store, there's code signing involved, and typically when they're installed and run, they are sandboxed, containerized. The application only has access to its own resources and the specific resources it needs in order to perform its functions. That's not the case with WordPress plugins. They are, they're installed in your WordPress environment, and they have full access to everything that the WordPress instance has, which is obviously a large risk. So we see things like a small, maybe slightly less used plugin become compromised in some way, or even indeed maliciously uploaded with a sort of backdoor in it. And that plugin might then go out and look for instances of WooCommerce installed. I think WooCommerce is probably the largest and most well-used commerce plugin for WordPress, and inject a credit card skimming utility into that WooCommerce install, because that one plugin is able to interact with the entire WordPress environment. So that's that's a big risk there, and a really impactful one, and doesn't even require the actual WordPress, the WooCommerce plugin itself to be vulnerable. It just is attacked by a fellow plugin. And as again, I think probably one of the biggest vulnerabilities, misconfigurations really, I suppose, is one that Arron touched on earlier, and is a really common initial access point for attackers on WordPress instances. Default username is admin. So that's a really easy one for people to try. And as Arron says, /WP admin /WP login. These are two resources which in most cases are going to redirect you to a login page on WordPress, where you can with a default configuration, you can just sit there hammering that all day long with password attempts. So yeah, it's really easy to find those entry points on WordPress as well.
Excellent, thanks, Hugh. Related question. So listeners to this particular episode may well be running WordPress instances themselves and think, actually, you know what, I'd like to check the security of my WordPress instance off the back of this. How can they do that? So what steps can they do to check essentially where they're at with things right now?
Yeah, sure. So an obvious follow-on to I guess the point we were just discussing is if you change your login directory, you can set that away from WP admin and WP login. You can set that to any sort of long string that might be hard to guess. That is going to significantly cut down on the sort of automated bot attempts to compromise your WordPress site. A lot of this stuff isn't attacked by humans. They're just our bots that crawl the web looking for WordPress sites and attack them like that. So that's going to knock a huge number of automated attacks off your site. I guess secondarily to that, we've got the sort of generic stuff that we'd recommend for any website or web application that not specific to WordPress. So regular sort of penetration testing, vulnerability scanning, that we recommend generally. From a WordPress specific context, there's a really good utility called WP Scan. There's free tiers and paid tiers. By default, it will with the free tier, it will go through and you provide it your WordPress content directory and your WordPress plugin directory. It will go through, it will scan your application, your WordPress instance, and it will pull back a list of all the plugin and theme versions that you're running, and whether there are known vulnerabilities in those. The WP Scan organization maintain that massive list of sort of very up to date WordPress vulnerabilities and things like that, which is really useful for you for quickly identifying what might be out there. Again, there are also plugins to add to your site which help automate some of this stuff for you. There's like the one we discussed earlier, the all-in-one security plugin. Unfortunately, in this case, it happens to be a vulnerable plugin, which doesn't prove my point very well. But generally, these security plugins do improve your security posture. But it's also important to remember that attackers are also going to be using these tools. So they are going to look for vulnerabilities in these common plugins that they know organizations are relying on. WP Scan, they're also going to be using that for their own purposes. So they're going to be running the scans just as you are. So yeah, double-edged sword there, but good to keep on top of. So at least then you know what other people are going to be potentially finding on your site.
Excellent, thanks, Hugh. Arron, just bring you in there. What other parts and bits and pieces can organisations do to secure their WordPress instances? Maybe there's the governance angle, maybe there's the supply chain angle that you kind of referenced in there. Is there specific things that orgs should be doing now to proactively, I guess, before things get compromised or exploited?
Yeah, definitely. Governance of WordPress and of your external estate, but specifically WordPress, your websites, your web applications. And if you focus it on the WordPress piece itself, well, what's the things that, if we're using WordPress as an organization, what are the things we care about? Well, we know that WordPress has a plugin ecosystem. We know there are people that have to have high privileged access to the CMS side of WordPress. So introduce some processes to make sure that those are vetted properly. So in the case of plugins, before a plugin can be added to your WordPress instance, make sure you get it reviewed by, if you've got an internal security team, great, use them to review, or just your IT admins at the very least, just to check, is this a trusted plugin? Are there lots of known vulnerabilities historically with it? What permissions is it asking for? What does it have access to? You can do things like that for the plugin side of it. For user access, as Hugh said, you could change the access URL, or you can put the access to the CMS side behind a VPN, or make the front end of your site a statically deployed version of WordPress, and actually you only ever do the development and updating on an internal system that then gets cloned and pushed externally with no administrative console, things like that. So look at how you mitigate and put compensating controls around the known weaknesses of operating a large CMS like WordPress. Hugh already mentioned plugins, again, for security plugins in particular, consider some of those, but I would say that be cautious with how many plugins you end up using. And other than that, it's just the typical hardening that you would do on any system. So credential management, make sure that's done appropriately, MFA where you can, follow the hardening guides that exist from the WordPress organization and other entities that have written hardening guides for WordPress. So yeah, build all of that into your WordPress deployment pipeline so that you're doing regular reviews and auditing of this as well.
Excellent, thanks guys. So some really good advice in there. Brilliant. So we're going to move on to the next topic, which is a discussion opinion section of this episode in particular. So we're going to talk about the newly announced, so this week, the US Cyber Trust Mark. But more widely than that, we're going to talk about standards and the role they play in cybersecurity. Are they good? Are they bad? Are they indifferent? What are they driving? Do we like them? Okay. So clearly an opinion piece here. And so guys, we'll have a discussion around it. So just to give you a bit of background to the listeners, the US Cyber Trust Mark is essentially a labeling program for smart devices. It's been announced that the release ultimately, if you like, by the Biden administration. So the full criteria of it isn't fully defined just yet. It's likely it's going to be based off the NIST recommended criteria for cybersecurity labeling for consumer Internet of Things IoT products. A bit of a mouthful, but that's essentially what it's going to be. And what it is a shield, I think, in this instance. So you come along to buy your smart speaker at Best Buy or whatever US retailers there are, and you look for your smart speaker and you look for the one that's got the shield because you know that's got or it's compliant to the Cyber Trust Mark, essentially. So you can have some confidence in how it's put together, the security measures that are embedded within it. Is it being designed securely? All that kind of good stuff. The baseline product criteria has things in there such as, and I'm going to read it verbosely because it's quite a long list. So asset identification, product configuration, data protection, internet interface access control, software update, cybersecurity state awareness, documentation, information and query reception, information dissemination, product education and awareness. So quite a wide, broad range of stuff, essentially. What it looks like the criteria tries to do is match up those baseline criteria with attack types or techniques from the MITRE ATT&CK framework, for example. So you can kind of map out how an attack might work against those baselines. They're using they've got the concept of using QR codes, so you can come along to your product, scan the QR code that's on it from a security perspective, and see the up-to-date picture for that product. So, is it still supported? Is the documentation correct? Is there a vulnerability disclosure procedure? All that kind of good stuff. I think that's a particularly good piece of idea, essentially. So, yes, a product, for example, you buy it off the shelf and it's not secure forever, right? So, I think there's this continual view of how it looks and the life cycle of a product to be determined and thought about when these things are being developed. So guys, let's come off mute and we'll have a chat about it, what we think. So Hugh, I'll come to you first. Is IoT security a major issue? I know you've covered it in a previous episode some time ago. Is it still something we should be concerned about as an industry and as a society?
Absolutely right. And if it wasn't, I don't think they would have invested the time and effort in bringing this standard to the fore. Yeah, we covered wearables specifically in October 21. I think there are certain sort of key things about IoT devices that make them really important and make their security sort of impactful. We're looking at things that often have microphones, cameras, some sort of human computer interaction element normally. And frequently we'll see them used as part of an organization's security toolkit. So things like CCTV cameras. So obviously the security of this sort of device is imperative, really. And this sort of standard is really going to push things forward, I hope. For a long time, IoT devices have been small, sort of underpowered chips normally, just by nature of the sort of embedded device and things they are. But modern devices, they can support encryption, which is a major step forward, because previously that was, highly, very rare, because encryption is incredibly computationally expensive to support. So it's great that devices are moving towards that, and standards like this are coming into place. But I mean, just to sort of demonstrate the fact that IoT security still is a major issue, there's an activity called Shodan Safari. So Shodan is a massive sort of search engine full of network connected devices, everything on the internet, anything that will go out and scan the entire web. If you just look for some of the common IoT ports and protocols and things like that on Shodan, the number of things that you pull back, CCTV cameras with unencrypted real-time streaming protocols and things like that, it's huge, right? So clearly there is a need for an improvement in IoT security.
Brilliant, thanks you. Arron, we're talking roughly here about kind of consumer level impacts and consumer level devices, but is there an impact to be considered here for enterprises and organisations? So I'm an enterprise. I'd like to put some CCTV cameras in, or I'd like to put some door access control things in, or whatever it might look like. So some devices that can help me run my building, my premise, or my business. Is there things that we need to consider from an org-wide perspective, enterprise level perspective, when we're doing this type of stuff?
Yeah, 100%. Actually, there's two sides to the enterprise and organizational piece. There's first, actually, all those consumer devices that are completely unvetted by you as an organization. Me wearing my smartwatch, my mobile phone, maybe I brought in a little, IoT cat that sits on my desk and talks to me, whatever it might be. Those are all non-organization devices that still may have these issues and vulnerabilities. They may be recording sound if they've been compromised. They may be tracking location data if I'm in a sensitive location that I shouldn't have my location data tracked in, those sorts of things. And that's kind of, as an organization, you need to have a view and an understanding that there may be an element of these untrusted devices not connected to your network, but still potentially inside your facility in some form or another, tracking people or data, voice communications.
But that comes down to your risk appetite, right, as a business. So
100%. Down to your risk appetite. We've mentioned it before multiple times, I think, in previous podcasts, that typically critical national infrastructure, public sector, you're going to have a lower appetite for this sort of stuff. At commercial enterprise, I don't think most organizations where their offices are publicly known and people share on LinkedIn that they work there, probably don't care so much that someone's brought their watch into work. So yeah, take it with a grain of salt. Don't go out there and ban smartwatches in your organization. Think about the context of where you are. So that's it from the kind of consumer devices side. But absolutely, on the flip side, organizations and enterprises themselves are really getting into the IoT space more and more now. Security cameras, they're not typically these simple closed CCTV networks now. They're often just connected to the corporate network or some other thing, and they've got a lot more functionality than they used to have. They weren't just being recorded straight onto a tape. Now you might have an app that you can interact with them and view the camera footage from anywhere at any time, that sort of thing. You've also got other applications, smart doors, that are considered IoT to a degree. They were typically on their own networks. Again, we're beginning to see them bleed into broader organization security postures now, as opposed to being an entirely closed off network. They might integrate with Active Directory, things like that. So yes, organizations should for sure be also considering the impact of IoT. And back to the whole original point of this being a new standard for the kite mark, if you like, for IoT that's going to sit on IoT devices, I think it will give organizations some level of assurance, if you like, maybe not assurance, but at very least a little bit of confidence in their supplier if they can do that due diligence and the supplier says, you know what, yep, I've got ISO 27001, I've got the new IoT Trustmark, I've got a few other certifications here, and it kind of means that when you do your due diligence to select a supplier as an organization, you feel like they've at least thought about this. They've at least got some way to evidence that they're doing X, Y, and Z to make you feel a bit more comfortable.
Okay, but again, with everything, there's no guarantees, right? So I think we get a sense of, or a feeling of security from maybe a recognized brand, for example, versus kind of a non-branded item we might have bought off Amazon or whatever, or Alibaba or whatever the kind of marketplace is, right? So I think there's a element where you might feel a bit more secure in the brand that you're using as well, perhaps. You mentioned kite marks, Arron, which I'm glad you did. Full disclosure, I used to work for PSI, so I've got a fairly good insight into the kite marks that they brought out and released. And they were they were around products. So secure, I think they call them secure applications now. So that's an application level kite mark that you can have. There's also IoT ones as well. They're different levels, and the levels relate to the use case of. And to be honest, they are pretty stringent. So I know, for example, if you're testing an application for a kite mark itself, then you'll be using, generally speaking, one of the OWASP ASVS levels, generally level 2, but sometimes level 3 as well. So they can be quite robust. I think the standards in that particular area are pretty good. Now, the one thing that's lacking is government level mandate for clients or for organisations to have a kite mark, for example. So very much voluntary basis at the moment, and people using that as a differentiator to market. There's other programs, standards, if you like, that exist. You've got the Code of Practice for Consumer IoT Security, and that's from the DCMS, the NCSC. It's kind of old now, it's about 5 years old. There's 13 controls in there. But to me and you and everybody who's in this industry, controls are fairly noddy, right? So they're things like non-default passwords and so on and so forth. So stuff that you would actively recommend anyway, just through the use of good practice. There's also things like the California's IoT law, which is called the Information Privacy for Connected Devices. And that came alongside the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, and they kind of released together. This one kind of got not as much publicity and not as much exposure, but they do exist now. And I think this one that they've brought out from the US government, the trust mark, I think is a good step, providing the criteria that sits underneath it is suitably written. So yes, it has to be a bit more in depth than just change the passwords or have a unique password, for example. So I think there's an element of that, and also they has to consider the life cycle of a device. A lot of cheaper devices might have a very limited life cycle of support. We're not going to release batches, or we might be using out-of-date libraries and software components. If at the point of shipping, there's no way to update them, for example. So I think there's an element here of life cycle as well. It's probably a wider question that we'll bring you both into on this one, but does the industry generally, so does the cyber industry, need more standards? And I think from a perspective of driving the market and driving the user, the buyer's market essentially. So do we need standards to drive good behaviours and therefore increase the security posture of all the organisations in a particular region, country, geography, wherever it might be? Arron, Hugh, whoever, I don't mind whoever comes in on that one first, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I don't mind going first. I know that from my perspective, I think there's this. I'm of two minds myself, actually. But actually, overall, I think it's a good thing for raising the bar. That minimum criteria, if you like, for IoT vendors in particular is where I care about this. In that, if they're just going off doing what they want, not having to worry about any standards or industry recognized bare minimum baselines on cybersecurity, they're not going to bother doing it. So by introducing one and then giving a little bit of consumer confidence, it improves their brand presence if they do have this kite mark, or they'll feel left behind if they don't have it. Then it's going to raise that bar on cybersecurity within the IoT market, right? They're going to start suddenly doing these things that they weren't doing before, that they need to get this accreditation, this kite mark, so that they can still have a brand that's has consumer confidence that organizations are going to want to deal with. So it's a little bit of a false market in the sense that suddenly this kite mark could become a thing that you just have to get. However, on the flip side, without it, we've already seen, and evidence has shown time and time again, that IoT devices, without this push to have a minimum baseline security criteria, they're not adopting security controls in many cases. Don't get me wrong, that doesn't apply to every IoT device. There are manufacturers out there that follow a well-designed process, a secure process, and they're quite happy to evidence all of their other existing certifications to support that. But I think this one helps raise that minimum bar. And it's a good thing for consumers in that regard, because it means that you as a consumer can very quickly identify, this brand is definitely doing something. I'd not heard of them before, but it looks like they've got the cyber trust mark. It looks like they have some transparency and they've got disclosure processes. Great, I'll trust buying this device now. So I think it's a good thing overall, although I appreciate it means there's just another thing for an organization to do if they're the ones that are having to implement this cyber trust mark scheme. I would say actually very quickly on that as well, because I'm sure Hugh wants to jump in any moment now. I think there's this need for this particular trust mark scheme to integrate perhaps a bit more heavily with existing standards. I myself, as someone that looks after an ISMS, I'd hate another standard to look after and have to do mapping. I know we're already doing a bunch of great stuff in terms of our controls, having to then do it, redo that mapping myself for the new trust mark rating is going to be really frustrating for me. It's another thing I have to do. It's another use of my time. If we can get some mappings, which I'm sure will come out in time, of actually, if you're doing this under, let's say, ISO 27001, because it's a very well-known one, then you're probably doing this already under new trust mark scheme, and just make our lives a bit easier as compliance managers and internal security teams to know that if we do X, it maps across to Y, much like the cybersecurity framework does, that's freely available and does these mappings.
Thank you, Arron. Yeah. Hugh, I don't know if you've got any kind of thoughts on a wider picture of standards within cyber. So are they useful? Is there a difference between frameworks and standards, for example?
Yeah, absolutely right. And I guess that's a key point there. Frameworks and standards. I guess looking at the NIST cybersecurity framework, if you genuinely go through the NIST CSF and feel like you've ticked every box there, and you did the same with ISO 27001, the goal of the two of them, you probably end up in a pretty similar state, right? Just with the standard, you get the rubber stamp, and with the framework, you get the warm fuzzy feeling inside. In terms of standards and whether we need more as a whole, I think with this one in particular, there is a clearly identified gap in the current sort of array of standards, and it really does identify and hopefully push forward an area that needs that. I think we are though at risk with a lot of standards that are coming out of cluttering the market with standards, right? And saying you need this, you need this, you need this, when really, like Arron says, if you look at the mappings of those controls against each other, there's a lot of duplication. So yeah, where necessary, and I think this one is absolutely all for it.
Okay. Yeah, and I think there's probably worth an extended point there of regulation without standards doesn't really work either. You can't regulate something without a standard for someone to follow as well. So I think there's a large part of that, and I think. Yeah, you're quite right. There's a big difference between frameworks and standards, and I look at something quite close to my experience in the past, which is pen testing. And there are definitely frameworks for pen testing, not so many standards. And then you kind of look at something like red teaming or adversary simulation, and there are frameworks that become a standard. I think so things like CBES and TIBA EU, that kind of stuff, which is the banking sector's standard for performing red teaming and adversary simulation work, and soon followed by StarFS, for example. I think that they are good examples of where a framework's evolved into something that's held as a standard by a regulatory body, and I think they're pretty robust. So I think there's a good argument for this kind of stuff driving it. And maybe in the past, the cybersecurity industry has been too immature to have proper standards for it. So it's kind of, it's always finding its feet, it's always moving, changing a lot and changing aggressively. Maybe we're at the point in time now where it's old enough now to be able to support properly regulation-driven standards. I don't know for sure, but obviously it's an interesting point of discussion to have, and certainly something that may well come along down the line, may not come along down the line. Brilliant. I think we've had a fairly decent discussion without really coming to loads of conclusions on that side of things. Any closing thoughts, Arron? Any closing thoughts from you either?
I guess I would say that don't think of standards as the end goal. I think they're a thing that helps. They're a bare minimum. They're better than nothing in that regard. But I wouldn't treat them as that's the only thing you should care about if you're the organization trying to get the standard. You should be thinking broader than an individual standard to how you apply your security controls. And again, go back to doing mappings for the secure controls framework and looking at how it maps to other standards. But then also on the flip side, if you're a consumer of it, don't just trust an organization because it has a rubber plate, a rubber stamp saying, yep, I've got this standard. Do your due diligence regardless, but maybe you set minimum criteria of standards are a good start point. Plus we want you to do this, that, and the other. That's just supply to due diligence there. So it doesn't remove the need for that. It just means that it makes your life a little bit easier when you come to pick these organizations to say, well, actually, this is my bare minimum that I consider acceptable. Thank
you, Arron. And Hugh, any closing thoughts from yourself?
Yeah, and I think I work with smaller organisations quite often who'll say 27,001 sounds great, but it's way off for us. It is an end goal for a lot of organisations, right? And I don't think you necessarily need to look at it in from the sort of standards perspective of all or nothing. You pass or you fail. If you look at it like a framework, there's guaranteed to be elements from that standard that you probably can adopt at your current organization's size that will improve your overall sort of security posture and sort of compliance with things. So yeah, do check them out even if you don't think you're ready for the whole thing, and see what you can take away and implement.
All right, thank you very much. Excellent contributions as always, guys. Some really good discussions in there. So September's episode, we'll publish a date imminently. We're going to be off from podcasting duties for the summer period, so we'll see you back in September. Thanks for all the support through the years, for all the listeners. This year. And we will wish you all a good summer and see you at some point in September. So from me, it's goodbye, thank you, and from Arron and Hugh, goodbye as well.
Yeah, thanks very much, folks. See you soon.
Cheers.